Okay, so radiographic rating charts are ways that we can put on a graph and show ourselves what sort of the limitations of the equipment is. Some of the limitations of the equipment, okay? So we're going to talk about three here. Radiographic rating charts. These sort of show us the maximum KVP, MA, or exposure time. Give me two of those things and I can tell you the maximum for the other one, okay? There are anode cooling charts and tube housing cooling charts. These are saying given an exposure that we made, we can calculate how much heat is produced, and we can say how long do we have to wait before we make the next exposure which will produce more heat. Okay, so radiographic rating charts. Let's take a look at these. One of the first things we'll want to be able to do, and this is worthwhile to take the notes for if you don't have it, if you have not yet, if you don't have it in your text, is to talk about heat units. So a heat unit is a way to calculate how much heat is produced during an exposure. And to calculate heat units, you simply take the KVP setting that you made, multiply that by the milliamperage setting, and multiply that by the time setting. We'll give an example in a moment here. Now this first formula, heat unit equals KVP times MA times time, is the basic one used for single phase equipment. So if you have a single phase unit like the one we have here at the school, this is the heat unit formula. KVP times MA times time, whatever the number you get, that's how many heat units you made for that exposure. If you have a multi-phase, 3-phase, 6 or 12 pulse, or high frequency, you produce more heat. You produce about 40% more heat, okay? So you use the same formula, but multiply by 1.4. It's a 40% increase. Why are you producing more heat with a multi-phase or high frequency unit generator than with a single phase generator? Why does it produce more heat?
There are no gaps. So there's more X-rays, there's more quantity.
Yeah, even before the X-rays, right, there's more electrical current being produced, right? And the electrical current is what's producing the heat, okay? So in other words, you're producing electrical current more of the time for any given exposure, right? A 1 second exposure on a high frequency machine versus a 1 second exposure on a single phase machine, the high frequency machine is going to make about 40% more heat because we're making equivalently more electrical current. Okay, good. So 3-phase multiplied by 1.4. But otherwise, that's the heat unit formula. Let me give you an example. And we'll see how we can put this to work. So this example says, how many heat units are generated by a high frequency X-ray machine for an exposure of 80 kVp, 300 MA for 1/10 of a second. This, by the way, is a 30 mass exposure. 300 times 0.1. 30 mass is like maybe a lumbar spine, right? Ribs maybe. Lower, like below diaphragm ribs. But in any case, that's the numbers, right? So you plug the numbers in. It's high frequency, so you multiply everything by 1.4. So 1.4 times 80 kV times 300 times 0.1. And we come out with 3,360 heat units produced for our exposure. So now we've made 3,360 heat units. And we can go refer to our cooling chart to see from having produced that many heat units, how long do we have to let the equipment cool down for before I can make the next exposure? Or can I just make the next exposure right away? Right? Have I not exceeded any maximum? I'm going to circle back around to that in a moment. I'm talking about the cooling charts. You can instead, if your equipment comes with a manual, which they all do, instead of calculating the heat units yourself, you can consult your manual and look for the radiographic exposure rating chart. So on this chart, you'll see the functions are plotted as MA numbers, and then you see the horizontal axis is exposure time, and the vertical axis is our peak kilovoltage. So it's a point combining the set kV and exposure time, must fall to the left of the MA line to be safe for anode heating. So for example, they give a technique of 70 kVp and 1 second exposure falls to the right of the 200 MA curve. So let's zoom in on that. 70 kVp, 1 second. So I'd find 1 second and 70 kVp, and I'm going to find the point where those two things meet. Right there. Okay? Anything to the left here, I can get to. Okay? Anything to the right, I cannot access. So I have to access something 200, 300, 400, or 500 over on this way. I can't make a 1 second setting at 70 kVp and get to the 100 MA station. Make sense? So it's telling me for a given time and kVp, what's my allowable MA setting? So these exposure charts would let us see that. Let's look at another one. So this one, instead of talking about kVp and time, they're saying given a technique of 300 MA in 0.2 seconds, if that falls below 110 kV, 110 kV or any other kV above would be unsafe. So let's look at that. 300 MA in 0.2 seconds. Let me zoom in here. We wanted 300 MA, 0.2 seconds. Sorry, I had to remind myself. Okay. So 300 MA, 0.2 seconds. I can access for 300 MA in 0.2 seconds anything that is now below this curve. Okay? Anything that falls above this curve, like I can't get to 110 kV because it's now above this green curve, 300 MA at 0.2 seconds. So I follow the 0.2 second line up where it meets with 300 MA. I can get to any kVp number below that point, but nothing above that point. So my maximum allowed kV is like 80 now. Okay, so this is telling me give me any two things, and I can tell you what the maximum is for the third. Okay, this is on older equipment that didn't really have these limitations built into the circuitry. On older equipment, you had to actually do this, okay? Nowadays, the equipment will just not let you, okay? You try to set, 300 MA, 0.2 seconds for an exposure, and then you try to set like 120 kV, the machine just won't let you do it, okay? It'll force you to go to a higher MA station or a longer exposure time or something. It'll change something to force you into using safer technical factors, okay? These are the technical factors, kVp, MA, and time. Let's look now back on the heat rating thing. Okay, so that heat unit formula I gave you just a second ago, kVp times MA times time, to calculate how much total heat is produced, can be applied to these things called cooling charts. Now there are cooling charts for the entire X-ray tube. There are cooling charts for just the anode. This one happens to be just an anode cooling chart. So it's basically telling you, you made an exposure, whatever settings you have, kVp times time times MA times time is how many heat units produced. You made an exposure, you made that many heat units, and all that heat was applied to your anode. So here's how hot your anode is now in heat units, okay? Now that you've made that many heat units, how long till it cools down back to zero? Okay, so on this graph, the vertical axis gives you the number of heat units you've made, and the horizontal axis tells you time in minutes. So using this graph, from 350,000 heat units produced, it's heat units times 1,000, 350,000 heat units produced, it would take me 14 minutes for it to cool down back to zero. So the way that you can use this in practice, let me read from here. The total heat capacity of the anode or tube housing, in this case we're talking about the anode, is at the starting point of the curve on the vertical axis, here set to 350,000. The total heat units for a particular exposure must be calculated first. From this point, I'm trying to read and think at the same time. From this point on the curve, follow along the number of minutes to allow for cooling. So let's say we made an exposure. We let it cool for a certain amount of time. Let's say I made a exposure and I want to let the tube cool down for 2 minutes. Okay, so let's see how cool the tube is at 2 minutes in. I'm going to find 2 minutes on the horizontal axis and follow that up until it meets that black line. That's right in the middle between 150 and 200,000 heat units, say 175,000 heat units, okay? I've cooled down about halfway now, all right? So as long as I make an exposure that does not bring me back to exceeding above 350,000 heat units, I can make that exposure, okay? If my next exposure will exceed the maximum capacity for the amount of heat the equipment can take, I just need to wait longer till it cools down more, okay? If I wait the full 14 minutes, then I can make however big of an exposure I want because the machine is cooled back down to 0 now, okay? or effectively 0. So that's why you do it. You make an exposure, you see how much time has elapsed, calculate your next exposure, and see if that next exposure will exceed the heat capacity of the equipment from where it's cooled down to. Okay. They took it out of the book. I think it became a little confusing over time for people because these are basically just, it's put into the equipment now, right? This is part of the hardware and software it's built in, and you are just locked out. You're just limited. It don't let you damage it, right? The equipment just does not let you hurt it anymore. Okay, but this is really something we used to focus a lot on. So you should know that they exist. I'll print these out and make sure you guys have them as a copy so that you can just refer to them. But looks like they've taken them out of the textbooks. That's something to consider. Good. So let's finish this section up by talking about extending our X-ray tube life. Good. How do we make our equipment last for as long as possible, right? You prevent the damaging effects of overheating the equipment. And one of the most damaging ways to hurt your equipment is to apply too much heat to it too quickly. Okay, this is the same idea as taking a very hot glass pan out of the oven and then tossing it into the cold sink water, right? That these drastic changes in temperature are not good for really any material. So this idea called thermal shock is a sudden extreme change in temperature, such as rapidly heating a cold anode. So it sits overnight. You get in the morning, you forget to warm the X-ray tube up. Maybe even worse than that, you forget to even turn it on, okay? The X-ray tube will build up a little bit of heat because it always runs a little tiny bit of current through the filament and stuff after you turn it on. You just forget to turn it on, okay? Doctor orders a lumbar spine and it wants it now, right? And so you go in, you don't warm the X-ray tube up at all, and you begin to shoot at high kVp numbers and high mass numbers, okay? And you apply a lot of heat to the filament and the anode very quickly. This can, if it doesn't break the equipment right then, this can, after doing this repeatedly, really, really damage the equipment. Okay, this can even, as they show here, this anode has been cracked from doing that. This anode was also cracked. This is more like a chronic crack, right? It's a big crack having developed over time from the anode pitting. This crack is from thermal shock. Similarly with the filament, right, to prevent damage to the filament, it is kept warm. This is why I told you if you just left your machine off, everything's off, right? So if you left your machine off and then turned it on and immediately went to high exposures, it's very damaging. The filament is kept warm throughout the day, Okay, there's a small amount of current that runs through the filament that just sort of keeps it warm. That way, when you go to hit the prep button and you build that space charge, it's kind of already warm and it's not going to be, very damaging. It's a similar idea to why you don't like turn your car on and go do burnouts, right? You turn your car on in the morning and you sort of maybe hopefully you do, I don't know if you do, you should let it warm up a little bit, right? Maybe even like 15 minutes, not idling in your driveway, but like, 10, 15 minutes of like regular driving before you were to do any like gnarly driving, right? People that race cars, they need to warm their cars' engines up, right? Among other things, they need to warm those cars' engines up before they take them and run them at high RPMs and lots of energy put into them. This prevents damage to the equipment. In our purposes, prevents damage to vehicles and for that purpose. But so we need to make sure that we warm our X-ray machines up every day, and if they have not been used for several hours, we also should warm them back up. Does anyone have a warm-up procedure that they've been shown in the mornings? Has anyone not known to warm an X-ray? I'm getting that you have not been shown to warm your X-ray tube up.
Probably like when I was 18, I think.
Yeah.
But that was the old machines like that.
Yeah.
I'm like, and we have a brand new machine now because our old one you could hear the rotors.
Oh yeah.
Loud as can be.
So, the filament is kept warm. That's not the purpose of warming. The warming is to this big hunk of metal. It's to heat this big hunk of metal up, right? So that way it's already warm. That way when we blast it with a big stream of electrons, we don't overheat it too quickly, okay? And again, it's the same idea as letting your car warm up in the morning or, letting a hot pan cool down before you put it in the sink. It's just the reverse, right? Whenever the machine has been shut off or no exposures have been made for several hours, warm-up exposure should be made. And you want to follow the manufacturer's recommendations, but here's a recommendation. Set 70 kVp, 200 mA, and a 1-second exposure time. Make 3 exposures, but space them out. They say 5 seconds apart. I do something a little differently. I make what do I make? 10 mass. I set 10 mass, 10 MAS, so 100 MA for a tenth of a second. And then I set 50 kV, make an exposure. I let the rotor stop spinning. 60 kV, make an exposure, let the rotor stop spinning. 70, 80, 90, and up to 100. Okay, and each time we're adding more and more and more heat with each exposure. And now the machine's warmed up after we get, to let's say 100 kV, and we can use the equipment now throughout the day. But if we go several hours without using it, it's probably a good idea to heat it up again. As you saw, the rating chart or the cooling chart let the machine cool down to almost 0 after about 14 minutes, right? So these cool down relatively quickly. So it's a good idea to warm these up. Some will have a warm-up mode. The nicer, newer ones, you just hit warm-up mode, you hold the button down, and it just makes several exposures on its own without you actually setting anything. But you want to follow manufacturer's recommendations to warm up the equipment and then continually warm them up as long periods of time go by. Overnights, for sure. Like in the morning, someone has to warm it up. Okay, good. Here's another thing. Radiographic techniques, technical settings, whatever setting you make for an exposure that combine high kVp and low mass rather than low kVp and high mass would generate less heat units. kVp times mass times MA times time is your number of heat units produced. It's just, by the way, it's just kVp times mass would be another way to think about it. It's equivalent. So you can take and calculate heat units for these two exposures. Now, these two exposures are identical, okay? In the amount of radiation they produce, they're identical, okay? There's a rule. For every 15% increase in kilovoltage, that's equivalent to having doubled the MAS, okay? So if I wanted to set 76 kV and 80 mass, if instead I raised the kVp to 100, but lowered the mass to 20, these two, 76 at 80 and 100 at 20, produce the same amount of radiation, okay? But calculating the heat units, 76 at 80 makes 6,080 heat units. 100 at 20 makes 2,000 heat units. We're making 3 times less, 30% of the radiation dose, right? 30% of the heat units produced at this high kV versus the low kV. On top of that, this is a lower exposure for your patient. Okay, I said it produces the same exposure, but the trick with it is it produces, these two settings produce the same amount of exposure at the image receptor. The patient actually receives significantly less radiation with this higher KVP and lower mass setting here. So the receptor gets the same exposure, the patient gets less. And the trick is with high KVP, more of the x-rays pass through the patient, which means that they don't receive or retain that exposure. Okay, we'll talk a lot about that in Principles of Exposure module. But yeah, so the moral of the story is high KVP and low mass settings are good for the equipment and good for the patient. They have a downside. They're worse for the image, okay? But it's very minor. So we like these high KVP, low mass settings nowadays. It was worse, it was a lot worse on film equipment. But now with all digital equipment, this image detail change is almost negligible. And so now we just get to have the nice good effect of high KVP is good for the patient and good for the equipment. Okay, so that second technique, 100 at 20, produced fewer heat units, saves patient exposure, results in the same exposure at the image receptor, and that is a good thing to do. All right, the last slide here, things to think about. Avoid excessive rotoring. You hit the prep button on the machine, and if you haven't been in an x-ray room, you will eventually. You hit the prep button on the machine to begin the space charge on the cathode side and spin the rotor on the anode side. Don't do that more than you need to, okay? The only times where you should be rotoring and like waiting are with very small children or somebody who can't control their movement. Okay, you have to wait till someone is kept still, or often with infants, you have to wait until they're crying, and they take a big breath in after they cry, and then you have to be ready to prep or to hit that exposure button very quickly. Okay, so sometimes you have to do it. All of the other time, don't do that. Whenever possible, employ radiographic techniques with high KVP, low mass. We just said it produces less heat and spares patient dose. Whenever high techniques are used with multiple sequential exposures, you should consult your radiographic rating chart to make sure you're not overloading the equipment. And then, very importantly, there's going to be somebody who's sort of in charge of keeping track of the equipment, and then they will also have technicians who come and service the equipment regularly. When those technicians come out, report the abnormal sounds, the weird stuff to them, okay? It's like talking to your mechanic about the problems with your car. Tell them about those problems. If you're not the person who's in charge of keeping track of how the x-ray room's running, right? Not the technician, but somebody within the office, tell the person in the office about these problems, right? If you're hearing something, talk to them about them, right? That way these problems can be taken care of by the appropriate people. But yeah, report any rough, rotoring, or coasting sounds to some supervising person, all right? And that gets us to the end of chapter 9. Okay, we got here right on time too.